We like to think we're civilized, that our rules are based on logic and reason. That's a comforting lie. Today, we're digging into the foundations, the first attempts to create order. And you'll see that the operating system for humanity has always been powered by two things: absolute terror and spectacular stupidity. These aren't just 50 strange laws. This is the source code of our own madness. 1. Let's start with a rule that's less about punishment and more about jaw-dropping absurdity. The Hittites of ancient Anatolia had a legal code that reads like a deranged farmer's almanac, especially regarding bestiality. They were obsessed with the specifics. If a man had sex with a horse or a mule, there was no punishment. Apparently, that was just an adventurous Saturday. However, if a man did the same with a pig or a dog, the penalty was death. Why? The law offers zero explanation. What do you think their reasoning was? Seriously, drop your theories in the comments because we are stumped. 2. The Middle Assyrian Empire was obsessed with social order, and they used clothing to enforce it with an iron fist. By law, all respectable women, wives, widows, and daughters of free men, were required to wear a veil in public. But here's the kicker. It was illegal for prostitutes or female slaves to wear one. It was a legally enforced visual caste system. If a prostitute was caught wearing a veil, she was subjected to a brutal public humiliation, stripped of her clothes and beaten 50 times to ensure everyone knew her designated place in society. It's a rare case of being punished for dressing too modestly. 3. Ancient Rome's concept of family was intense. Under the law of the 12 tables, the pater familias, or the male head of the household, had absolute power, called patria potestas. This power was so complete that he had the legal right to sell his own son into slavery. If the son was lucky enough to be bought by a compassionate master who freed him, he would return to his father's control. The father could then sell him again. Only after the third time being sold and freed was the son legally independent. Talk about a tough childhood. 4. Let's talk about Hammurabi's obsession with quality control. His famous code addresses the critical issue of bartenders. If a female tavern keeper served a low-quality brew or tried to shortchange a customer on the grain-for-beer exchange rate, the punishment wasn't a bad review. She was to be thrown into the water. This wasn't just a business regulation, it was a promise. The beer in Babylon better be good, or the person serving it was going for a permanent swim. 5. The Hittites are back, this time not with animal drama, but with extreme price fixing. Their laws dictated the exact cost of almost everything, and the level of detail is hilarious. A prized plow ox was worth 12 shekels of silver. A regular ox was 6. The hide of a bull was 1 shekel. They even priced out live animals versus butchered meat. It reads less like a legal code and more like the world's first and most rigid Amazon catalog. There was no haggling, no shopping around for a deal. The price was the price, or it was a crime. 6. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest legal texts we have, shows that justice was anything but equal. It lays out the penalty for divorce, and it's all about who you are. If a man divorced his first-ranking wife, he had to pay her 1 mina of silver, a huge sum. But if the man divorcing his wife was a former slave, the fine was only 1/3 of a mina. It's a literal class-based discount on breaking a marriage vow, written right into the law. 7. Be careful what you sing in ancient Rome. The 12 tables had a law against casting evil incantations or magical chants intended to harm someone else. But the truly wild part was the specificity. The law was primarily concerned with magical songs that could lure your neighbor's crops from their field into yours. If you were caught performing agricultural theft via black magic karaoke, the penalty was death. They didn't care if you cursed the man, but heaven forbid you magically mess with his wheat. 8. So, what happens if your property harms someone? The ancient law of the goring ox, found in the Book of Exodus, has a fascinatingly layered answer. If someone's ox gored a person and they died, the ox was to be stoned to death, but the owner was off the hook. It was a tragic accident. However, if the owner knew the ox was aggressive and had been warned and then it killed someone, the ox was still stoned, and this time, the owner was put to death too. It's one of history's first and most brutal laws on criminal negligence. 9. The Romans eventually got tired of over-the-top public displays. By the time of the 12 tables, they decided funerals were getting a little too theatrical. So they enacted a statute limiting the number of professional mourners, women paid to wail, to just 10. This provision also explicitly forbade women from scratching their cheeks in a show of grief, because apparently that was a real problem. Imagine the government having to legislate against excessive sadness. It's like a Roman official telling you, okay, you can be devastated, but let's keep the performance a 6 out of 10. 10. Back to Hammurabi, who had some very strong opinions on professional liability. His code offered the ultimate high-stakes performance review for surgeons. If a doctor performed a major operation and the patient died, or if the procedure cost the patient an eye, the punishment was terrifyingly direct. The surgeon's hands were to be cut off. This wasn't just a deterrent. It was the world's most brutal malpractice policy, ensuring that no surgeon ever had a second oops moment. 11. The Spartans were obsessed with making more Spartans, so they had zero tolerance for bachelors. In ancient Sparta, it was a legitimate offense for a man to remain unmarried past a certain age. The punishment wasn't a fine, it was ritual humiliation. Every winter, these bachelors were forced to march naked around the city's marketplace, singing a song about how their disgraceful condition was all their own fault. What do you think? Would a little public shaming work in your city? Tell us in the comments. 12. The Hittites continue to be the champions of bizarrely specific regulations. Their legal code contained an entire section on bees. If you stole a swarm of bees from someone else's hive, you had to pay a fine of 6 shekels of silver. However, if the hive was empty at the time you stole it, the fine was only 3 shekels. This implies they had a very clear market value for bees on the go versus just their real estate. It's the world's first and most detailed ancient beekeeping insurance policy. 13. Let's take a breath and travel to ancient Ireland, where the Bran laws were less about brutality and more about beautiful, baffling detail. They had specific edicts for cat ownership. A cat's job was to protect the barn from mice, but the owner had a duty to ensure the cat didn't get too fat or lazy. If you killed a neighbor's cat, the penalty was a cat fine. You had to pile grain over the dead cat, held up by its tail, until the entire animal was covered. It's the most strangely wholesome punishment we've ever found. 14. The Qin dynasty in China was famous for its strict philosophy of legalism, which meant controlling everything, including emotions. Under one infamous decree, it was a requirement to grieve appropriately. If a family member died and you were caught not crying at their funeral, you could be punished by having your beard and eyebrows forcibly shaved off. Can you imagine your boss checking to make sure you're shedding enough tears at grandma's funeral? Let us know how you'd fake it. 15. In Hammurabi's Babylon, not all punches were created equal. The legal code made it crystal clear that your social status determined the consequences of violence. If a nobleman struck another nobleman, he paid a fine. But if that same nobleman struck a commoner, the commoner got nothing, and there was no punishment. And if a commoner dared to strike a nobleman, he was publicly whipped 60 times. It wasn't just a system with privilege built in, it was a legally enforced VIP pass for assault. 16. While many ancient statutes were brutal, some seem almost progressive. In ancient Egypt, one reported rule made it illegal to mock a person for being bald. Yes, you heard that right. While other cultures were legislating death for stealing cabbages, the Egyptians were allegedly concerned with protecting the feelings of the follically challenged. It might be the world's first officially mandated safe space, and it was created for bald guys. 17. The Vikings took insults very, very seriously. A formal, legal insult often involved creating a nid, or an insult pole. This was a wooden pole, sometimes carved with runes or a horse's head, which you would point at your enemy's farm while reciting a curse. This was considered a magical attack of the highest order, and the perpetrator could be declared an outlaw. This wasn't just a fine, it was a declaration of open season on you, making it legal for anyone to kill you on sight. 18. Hammurabi had a terrifyingly specific regulation for wet nurses. If a family entrusted their baby to one and the baby died in her care, there was an investigation. If it was discovered the wet nurse had tried to cover it up by secretly substituting another baby in its place, her punishment was monstrous. Her breasts were to be cut off. The Babylonians really took the idea of eye for an eye to its most grotesque and hyper-literal extreme, and then some. 19. Think traffic is bad now? Julius Caesar would agree with you. In the 1st century BC, Rome was suffering from epic gridlock caused by thousands of wagons and chariots clogging the narrow streets. His solution? An ordinance that banned most wheeled traffic from the city center during the first 10 hours of the day. Only vehicles for construction, religious processions, or official state business were allowed. Everyone else had to wait until evening. It's strangely comforting to know that complaining about rush hour is a 2,000-year-old tradition. 20. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi, had a unique and terrifying method for determining guilt in cases of sorcery: trial by ordeal. If you were accused of witchcraft, you were taken to the river and thrown in. If you sank, you were considered guilty, and the accuser could claim your property. But if you floated, you were proven innocent by the river god himself. So, the only way to prove your innocence was to be a bad swimmer. Flawless logic. 21. The ancient Athenians invented democracy, and they also invented the ultimate form of cancel culture: ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile any politician for 10 years. The target didn't have to commit a crime, they just had to be too popular, too powerful, or frankly, just too annoying. If 6,000 citizens scribbled your name on a piece of pottery, you were out. Imagine being so successful that your society's legal response is, yeah, you need to go away for a decade. 22. In the ancient Cretan city of Gortyn, their legal code laid out the fines for adultery with incredible detail, and it was all about status. If a free man was caught with another man's wife, the fine was 100 staters. But if he was caught with a female slave from his own household, the fine was just 2 staters. This wasn't just a law, it was a price list for infidelity that openly declared some people's dignity was worth 50 times more than others. Does this kind of tiered justice still exist today? Let us know your take in the comments. 23. Back to the Hittites, who were masters of hyper-specific purity regulations. One statute dictated that if a pig drank from a pot, that pot was now unclean. If a free person then touched that contaminated pot, they too became unclean. The solution wasn't just to wash your hands. It involved a complex purification ritual with a sheep and a fine paid to the temple. It's a level of religious bureaucracy so intense, you'd need a lawyer just to figure out how to do your dishes. 24. The ancient Hebrew law found in the book of Leviticus contains perhaps the world's first fashion-based criminal code. It was illegal to wear clothing made of mixed fabrics, specifically a blend of wool and linen. There's no dramatic punishment listed, but the decree itself is baffling. For a society dealing with life and death issues, taking the time to outlaw a specific textile blend is a special kind of legislative priority. The ultimate fashion crime wasn't socks with sandals, it was chatnez. 25. Let's have a moment of sanity, brought to you by the Athenian statesman Solon. Before his reforms in the 6th century BC, Athens had a brutal system of debt bondage. If you couldn't pay your debts, your creditor could legally force you and your entire family into slavery. Solon passed a radical decree that canceled all existing debts and made it illegal to use a person's body as collateral. It sounds like common sense now, but at the time, telling the rich they couldn't enslave the poor anymore was a truly revolutionary act. 26. The Qin dynasty in China took the concept of a neighborhood watch to a terrifying extreme. The population was organized into groups of 5 to 10 families. Under their legalist doctrine, if one person in the group committed a crime, everyone else in the group was legally obligated to report them. If they failed to do so, they would receive the same punishment as the criminal, which often meant being cut in half at the waist. It effectively turned every neighbor into a potential state executioner. 27. The laws of Manu from ancient India were obsessed with maintaining the caste system. One rule states that if a person from a lower caste has the audacity to try and teach a Brahmin, a member of the priestly class, about his duties, the king should have hot oil poured into the offender's mouth and ears. It's perhaps the most violent stay-in-your-lane rule in all of history. What's the modern equivalent of being punished for giving your boss unsolicited advice? 28. The Romans had a mind-bending approach to property rights called usucapio. This provision stated that if you took possession of someone else's property and used it openly for a specific period, 1 year for movable goods, 2 years for land, and the original owner didn't reclaim it, it legally became yours. It was literally finders keepers, losers weepers, but with lawyers. So if your neighbor borrowed your lawnmower and you didn't ask for it back for a year, congratulations, it was now legally his. 29. The Anglo-Saxons had a system of justice that basically functioned like a grotesque personal injury calculator. Their law codes list incredibly specific fines for every imaginable injury. Knocking out a front tooth would cost you 8 shillings. A canine tooth? Only 4. Cutting off someone's thumb was worth a whopping 20 shillings, but a little finger was a bargain at just 9. It was a complete itemized price list for dismemberment, as if justice was run by a very morbid accountant. 30. In Rome, being a Vestal Virgin was a position of immense honor, but it came with one very non-negotiable rule. You had to remain celibate for your 30-year term. If a Vestal broke this vow, she was considered to have polluted the entire state. The punishment was uniquely horrifying. Because her blood was sacred, she was taken to an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, and then sealed inside to die. It was Rome's most prestigious job for women, with a severance package that was literally suffocating. 31. Hammurabi had an ingenious and terrifying rule to discourage false accusations. If a man brought a serious accusation against another, say for a crime punishable by death, but couldn't prove it, the accuser would be put to death himself. It's the eye for an eye principle applied to the legal process itself. You weren't just a witness. You were a gambler betting your own life that the court would agree with you. It probably cut down on court backlogs, though. 32. The Vikings and other Germanic tribes operated on a system called Vergild, which literally translates to man price. This was a legal mechanism to prevent endless cycles of revenge killing. If you killed someone, instead of their family hunting you down, you could pay a set price to them to settle the matter. Every person had a price based on their social rank. A nobleman was worth far more than a farmer. It's a fascinating, if cold-blooded system. What do you think your Vergild would be today? 33. The laws of Manu in ancient India outlined a social structure where women were never independent. The rule stated, in childhood, a female must be subject to her father, in youth to her husband, when her lord is dead to her sons. A woman must never be independent. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a legally enforced cradle-to-grave ownership contract where the property just happened to be a human being. 34. You find a human bone in a field. What do? If you were a Hittite, you'd better have your rule book handy. Their code had a specific procedure involving taking the bone to town, finding a woman of the palace to perform a ritual, and then providing an ox, a sheep, and a feast. All that bureaucracy and expense just for stumbling upon a single bone. It was a level of legal hassle so insane, you'd be tempted to rebury the bone yourself and pretend you never saw it. 35. In Tang Dynasty, China, filial piety, absolute respect for one's parents, was the cornerstone of the law. This principle was so extreme that it was a capital crime for a child to sue their own parents, regardless of the reason. Even if your parents had wronged you, bringing a legal complaint against them was punishable by death. How different would our society be if you could be legally executed for taking your own parents to court? 36. The ancient Irish Bran laws took hospitality very seriously. Being a good host wasn't just polite, it was a legal obligation. If a traveler came to your door, you were required to provide them with quality food, drink, and lodging. If you failed, your guest could legally sue you for damages to their honor. It was the ancient world's answer to a one-star Airbnb review, except this one came with actual legal consequences. 37. The ancient Athenians loved to argue, but they drew a line at public slander. The statesman Solon instituted a law making it illegal to defame a living person in a public space like a temple or courthouse. The penalty wasn't death, but a simple and immediate fine. 3 drachmas paid to the person you insulted, and 2 more to the public treasury. It was a brilliant and practical solution to shut down the trolls of the ancient world. 38. Hammurabi's code had a specific law for a wife who was a gadabout, a woman who neglected her home to wander around town, socializing and belittling her husband. If a wife was found guilty of this, her husband had 2 options: divorce her instantly with no financial penalty, or take another wife and keep the first one in the house as a slave. A truly enlightened set of choices for marital discord. 39. In ancient Hebrew law, property lines were sacred. One of the most severe curses in the book of Deuteronomy is reserved for the person who moves their neighbor's boundary stone. This wasn't just about theft, it was a profound betrayal of community trust. While the law doesn't specify a physical punishment, it promises divine retribution, effectively turning a simple stone marker into an object protected by a supernatural security system. 40. The Romans were apparently very suspicious of what happened after dark. One provision in the 12 Tables explicitly outlawed nocturnal meetings within the city. While likely aimed at preventing political conspiracies, the law was so broad it could be interpreted as a ban on any late-night gathering. It was a citywide curfew born from pure paranoia, where the government's official position was that any 2 people chatting after dark were probably planning a revolution. 41. The ancient Greeks, specifically in Athens, had a special legal process for dealing with inanimate objects that caused a person's death. Yes, you read that correctly. If a roof tile fell and killed someone, the tile itself would be put on trial. A court would hear the case, and if the object was found guilty, its sentence was to be formally exiled from the territory of Athens, usually by being cast over the border. It's a legal system so thorough, it even held architecture accountable for its actions. 42. In ancient China during the Han Dynasty, officials were held to an incredibly high standard, especially when it came to their calendars. The imperial calendar was a sacred document tied to the cosmic order. If an astronomer or court official made a mistake in their calculations, even by a single day, it was considered a monumental failure that could bring bad fortune to the empire. The punishment for this clerical error? Death. It might be the only job in history where a typo could get you executed. 43. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who ruled parts of Spain, had a deep concern for the integrity of their warriors' hair. For a Visigothic man, long hair was a symbol of freedom and status. Their law code established that if one free man forcibly cut the hair of another free man, the offender had to pay a significant fine. It was considered a grave insult, on par with a serious physical injury. What do you think is the modern equivalent of being fined for giving someone a bad haircut against their will? 44. The Romans were apparently worried about a very specific type of theft: the theft of a corpse. The 12 Tables included a provision against stealing a body from its tomb, likely to prevent its use in magical rituals. But they also had a rule against removing the clothes from a body before burial. The punishment for either offense was severe. It was essentially a legal protection to ensure you entered the afterlife fully dressed and undisturbed by necromancers. 45. Let's return to the Brehon Laws of Ireland for a moment of beautiful pastoral absurdity. These statutes contained the law of the bee judgment, which outlined what happens if you're stung. If a bee stung you and you killed it in retaliation, you owed its owner a fine. However, if the bee stung you without provocation and died in the process, the bee's owner owed you a portion of the honey as compensation for your pain. It's a legal system that understands that even bees have to take responsibility for their actions. 46. The Hittites had an interesting perspective on arson. If you set a man's house on fire, the punishment was appropriately severe. You had to rebuild the house. But here's the Hittite twist. The law adds that whatever was inside the house that burns, be it man or cattle or sheep, he shall not make it good. So you're on the hook for the building materials, but any living thing that perished inside? That's just considered collateral damage. It's a bizarrely specific insurance policy that covers the structure, but not the contents. 47. The ancient Sumerians might have invented the world's first alimony law, and it was brutal. According to the code of Ur-Nammu, if a man decided to divorce his first-ranking wife, he had to pay her 1 full mina of silver, a fortune at the time. However, if a woman decided she wanted to divorce her husband, her fate was much darker. She was to be thrown into the river, weighted down with a stone. It was the ancient world's most expensive, "It's not you, it's me." 48. The Athenian legal system had a peculiar rule for murder trials. A person accused of homicide was allowed to give one speech in their own defense. After that speech, but before the verdict was rendered, they were given the option to voluntarily go into exile. If they chose to leave, the trial would end, and they would be forbidden from ever returning to Athens under penalty of death. It was a legal, get-out-of-jail-free card, but the price was your home, forever. 49. The laws of Manu strike again with a rule that feels like it was written by someone who really, really hated garlic. These ancient Indian texts classified garlic, onions, and mushrooms as forbidden foods for the upper castes. Eating them was believed to inflame worldly passions and pollute the mind. The reasoning was purely spiritual, but it was treated with the seriousness of law, making a simple mushroom stir-fry an act of religious defiance. Okay, we've covered 49 points and only one remains. But before we get to our grand finale, it's time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the single most unbelievably absurd rule from today's list goes to the Hittite law on bestiality. Simply because it raises so many baffling questions and answers absolutely none of them. The legal distinction between a horse and a pig is a mystery for the ages. Do you agree? Or did another rule deserve this questionable honor? Let us know in the comments what you think. And now, our final number. 50. We end with a Hittite law so bizarre it barely seems real. The statute reads, if a wolf seizes a sheep and the owner of the sheep finds it, the wolf must let it go. But if the owner does not find it, the wolf keeps it. This is an actual written law. It implies that if you don't catch the wolf in the act, the wolf gains legal title to your sheep. It's a law that sounds like it was written by the wolf. So it's easy to laugh at these ancient laws. But look again. Hammurabi's code was brutal, but brutally clear. If a builder's house collapsed and killed someone, the builder died. Cause and terrifyingly direct effect. Today, corporations poison entire regions and CEOs walk away richer after years of legal trickery no ordinary person understands. And now, over to you. What's worse? Savage justice everyone understood, or civilized justice only the rich can afford? So, what's your verdict? Let's see who's brave enough to pick a side in the comments. If you question more than you're supposed to, welcome home. Hit subscribe